This video is sponsored by Aiper Pool Cleaners. Oh, hey! Welcome to Flynndogg Woodwork. Well, I've been procrastinating for way too long now. I've been putting off building some storage cabinets in my shop for months now. And today, we're going to start the process of building these cabinets in this multi-part series. So let's not waste any time and start off with this build. So let me start off by saying I'm no cabinet builder, and I think that might be the appeal for this video, as we're going to walk through this build together and learn as we go. You see, I built a couple of benches early in my woodworking career, and this is one of them. A couple of things that I don't like about this bench is that it doesn't have any drawers or cabinets to put things away. All my tools get dusty as time goes on. Which probably means I don't need some of those tools, but let's face it, I'm not one to throw away tools. More importantly, however, I have no organization with that bench. Another bench that I made very early in my woodworking career is the one that sits right behind my table saw, and this has become a complete eyesore. It's got two flat surfaces, and all those surfaces do is to collect more tools. And it's right where this bench sits that we're going to build these new cabinets. So let's take a look at the design I've created so that we can get started. So here's a basic look at the cabinet design. Each one of these cabinets will be 2 feet wide, making the entire span 12 feet. And today, we're going to be focusing on making the carcasses for these cabinets, and I'm going to try it in 4 different ways to see which way I enjoy doing most. Now, if we go back to the drawing, you'll notice that there's 6 cabinets, 2 that are labeled B and 4 that are labeled A. The A cabinets are made in the exact same fashion, and the B cabinets are also made in the same fashion. The B cabinets will only have stretchers on top of them, as we'll add a solid surface on the top of those 2 cabinets in the end. The A cabinets will all have solid surface tops. And as of right now, I'm not quite sure what I'll put above the desk area, but I could foresee myself putting some more cabinets, some shelves, or even some French cleats. Now, to build these carcasses, I know that I need exactly 4 sheets of 3/4 inch birch plywood, as well as 1 sheet of 1/4 inch birch plywood. And that's because I tried out the app that I've been hearing about, the Cut List Optimizer. Let's take a look at the results it gave me. And this app really couldn't be easier to use. You simply add all the dimensions of the pieces you need for your project, and then it places them on a sheet of plywood for you so that you know your exact cuts. Once all the sheets of plywood are laid out, you can export the report to give you a cut list for all of your plywood. So with that cut list in hand, I made a trip outside of the shop to break down the plywood. And whenever I break down plywood, I always like to make my lengthwise cut first before I do any of my cross cuts. And with my first sheet of plywood ripped lengthwise, I can then break down my other 3 sheets. And here's 1, 2, and 3. And with my 4 sheets of plywood ripped down to more manageable pieces, I can then take them into the shop to clean up the factory edge, which for the wider pieces is exactly at 23.5 inches. So I'm not taking off a whole lot here, and I've got 4 of these boards to clean up. Next, I can adjust my fence to the thinner dimension, which is at 22.5 inches. And for this dimension, I only have to do this to 3 of the strips of plywood. Once I have all this plywood cut to width, I can now begin to do some cross-cutting. And for this, I'm actually going to dust off a tool that I don't use that often, and that's the festool MFT. And I'm using the MFT because these strips are just a little bit wider than my miter saw can handle. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll set my fence to 31 inches exactly, which is the length that a lot of these strips need to be cut to. Now, even though I've cleaned up the factory edges on the side, the ends are not clean, so I'll need to square those up. Once I have one end clean, I can flip the stop block down and cut it down to size at 31 inches. Now, these long strips were a little bit difficult to manhandle on the MFT, but I was able to get it done. One thing that really helped was to put an MFT clamp on the edge of the board and put support underneath the edge that was hanging off. And each one of these plywood strips gave me 3 pieces, so once the first cut was done, the other 2 were much easier. Then it was just a matter of rinse and repeat until all the strips were cut. Now, as I said earlier, the festool MFT is not something that I use on a daily basis, but it really is a lifesaver when you need to make cross cuts on larger pieces of wood. Now, one thing that's very important about the festool MFT is it needs to be calibrated every time you use it. It's really important that that back fence and the track are completely perpendicular, so I always spend a lot of time to make sure that they're perfectly square. But once it's calibrated, you can blaze through cuts very quickly. Before we move on, let's have a word from our sponsor, Aiper Pool Cleaners. So Aiper approached me a couple of weeks ago to check out their new cordless robotic pool cleaner, the Aiper Scuba S1 Pro. Now, I've been an Aiper customer for years now, and this is absolutely a product that I can stand behind. So let's take this amazing pool cleaner down to my pool and talk about some of its features. Aiper has developed the industry-first continuous horizontal waterline cleaning. This is called the Waveline technology. This allows the cleaner to have uninterrupted right-side horizontal waterline cleaning, utilizing the front rolling brush to remove all stains within 3 to 4 centimeters of the waterline. And this pool cleaner is a beast. It's got large suction port paired with 100 gallons per minute suction power with active front and rear roller brushes to provide strong cleaning performance. With its dual filtration system featuring a 180 UM and 3 UM filters, clears all common debris from pool water, while the ultrafine filter removes invisible algae and floating debris, providing deep level cleaning. And this thing's gonna last for a while. Quad brushless motors deliver enhanced cleaning power and extended accessory longevity. And if you're like me with kids that love to have all sorts of junk on the bottom of the pool, this thing's got front and rear integration of 2 infrared sensors. This enables the Scuba S1 Pro to achieve intelligent obstacle avoidance, enhancing cleaning efficiency. Now, one of my favorite features of this cleaner is that it's completely cordless. This prevents entanglement both on land and underwater, offering a worry-free cleaning experience. And all the key components of this cleaner are replaceable, giving it a long lifespan and durability. And not only that, but this pool cleaner is smart. Aiper's exclusive software algorithm combined with its infrared sensors enables WavePath 2.0 intelligent path planning, maximizing cleaning area and efficiency. Not to mention, it's got waterline retrieval, which makes it easy to remove and store. And believe it or not, this cleaner's even compatible with the Aiper app. Well, I'm really pleased with this Aiper Scuba S1 Pro. This is an absolute necessity for any family with a pool. Give yourself the summer off and let this bad boy do all the hard work for you. Well, thanks again to Aiper for sponsoring this video. To see how you can get this amazing pool cleaner, check out the links below for a discounted price. Now let's get back to the video and do some woodworking. So now that we've cut all the sides for these cabinets down to size, I now want to focus on the bottoms of the cabinets and some of the tops. So this is where we're going to cross cut our third sheet of plywood that we cut a little bit thinner at 22.5 inches. And you can see from our cut list that the dimensions of these pieces are 22.5 by 23.5 inches. Since we know the cutoffs of the pieces we just cut are exactly 23.5 inches long, we can use this to set the fence of the MFT. So what I'll do is I'll take one of the cutoffs and I'll make sure the edge of it is completely flush with our track. Once we've done that, I can adjust the fence on the MFT on the opposite side of the cutoff. And this should give us our perfect 22.5 by 23.5 pieces for the bottoms and the top. So in the same fashion, I quickly cross-cut our last 2 strips that were 22.5 inches down to size. Now that we have all the sides as well as the tops and bottoms for some of these cabinets cut out, we need to cut out the stretchers. And these are just 3-inch strips, so we'll do that over at the table saw. Now I kind of went back and forth with this, but since I had a large crosscut sled, I was able to use the crosscut sled to cut these strips down to 3 inches. We've got one more task to do, and that's to put in the slot for the back panel, which is made out of 1/4-inch plywood. So let's go ahead and do that. So here I'm just taking a piece of the scrap 3/4-inch plywood and adjusting my table saw height so that it goes about halfway through that plywood. And since I want this 1/4-inch plywood to sit in front of the 3/4-inch stretchers, I'll take that same piece of 3/4-inch plywood and place it in between the blade and the fence and lock the fence down. And with all those adjustments made, I can make my first pass on the plywood. And I'll have to make this groove on all the side panels, and there's a lot of side panels here, so I'll go through all the panels and make that groove. Now one thing that I did before making all these cuts is I labeled the front and the back of each one of the panels. That way I could be ensured that I'm making the cut on the right side of the panel. With the first pass made on all the panels, it's now time to make the second pass. And to do this, I'm simply tapping my fence over just a tad to increase the width of that groove. Then I can take a piece of scrap 1/4-inch plywood and make sure that it fits that groove perfectly. Once I was happy with the results, I could then increase the width of that groove on all the other panels. And while I was making my second pass, I was paying a lot of attention to where my first cut was. This is a great place to make a mistake if you're not paying attention. After all those grooves are cut, I thought this would be a great opportunity to put some shelf pinholes in all the cabinets that won't be receiving drawers. And once again, I'm really pleased with this goingmake jig. This makes this whole process quick and easy. Now we have most of the pieces cut out for the entire cabinet carcasses, except for the very back, and we'll do that at the very end. Now right about now you're probably asking about the toe kick, and that's something we'll address at the end of the video. Now as I was cutting all these pieces out, I had a couple of thoughts that made me want to change the design of this project, and we're going to pivot a bit. And this change is only going to affect 2 cabinets. I want to move the top cabinets to the very side, giving me just a little bit more counter space. Now the nice thing about this is it actually uses less material, as it's going to give us a longer surface all along the top. Which basically means instead of having to cover the entire tops of those 2 cabinets with plywood, now all we have to do is add stretchers. So let's get into building these cabinets. Now as I said in the very beginning of the video, I want to try putting these cabinets together in a couple different ways, actually 4 ways. And this will just be a personal test for me, since I'm kind of a newbie at this, to see which way I think works best for me when putting together cabinets. So I'll assemble 4 cabinets in 4 different ways, and then I'll assemble the last 2 using the preferred method. So what are the 4 ways we're going to do this? Well, we're going to use glue and brad nails, we're going to use glue and screws, we're going to use glue and pocket holes, and finally we're going to use glue and dominoes. So let's start off with what I assume will be the easiest of the bunch, but probably the least sturdy until the glue dries, the glue and brad nails. So this is about as simple as it gets. The first thing that I'll do is I'll add glue to all the seams and then place the 2 seams together. Then I can add a couple of these corner clamps to keep them in place while I drive in some brad nails. Once the first side panel was attached, I also added some F-style clamps to make sure that all the seams were coming together nicely. Once both side panels were attached, I could then add the stretchers using a little bit of glue and some quick clamps to hold them into place. Then I could nail them all together and secure this thing up. Once all the stretchers were in place, I then slid in the back 1/4-inch panel without any wood glue. Once that back panel was in position, I locked it into place with a couple of brad nails. Well, that's going to make our assembly of our first cabinet with brad nails and glue complete. So what are my overall impressions? Well, it went together very quickly, which is nice, and it's actually a little bit more sturdy than what I was expecting. However, you will notice I still have some clamps on this. And that's because the joints, although square, are really hard to get tight. Therefore, you have to add a few clamps to get that glue squeeze out. And it's really that glue that's going to hold this cabinet together. So let's try out our second option, which is wood screws and glue. Now this is a great option for shop furniture. It's quick and easy and very secure. Simply add the wood glue, pre-drill and countersink some holes, and then drive in some screws. And for these cabinets, I'm just going to use some ordinary 1¼ inch wood screws. Now one of the only downfalls of using this method is you're going to have exposed screws on any exterior surface where you drive in those screws. But for shop furniture, I really don't see a problem with this. That being said, however, I am trying to migrate away from having shop furniture that just looks like it was pieced together with glue and screws. And because of this, I'm probably going to only use these cabinets for interior cabinets where all those screws will be hidden. But this is an extremely easy method and doesn't really even require any clamps. After everything is glued and screwed together, we can add the back panel and tack it into place. Well, that's going to wrap up our second cabinet made entirely from wood glue and screws. My overall impression is this thing is very sturdy. And it took about the same amount of time to build as our other cabinet that we built with the brad nails and glue. The only issue with this cabinet is, however, is you see those exposed screws. But let's check out our next cabinet, which we're going to put together with pocket hole screws and glue. So this method takes a little bit more work up front, as you're going to have to add pocket holes to all of your joints. And there's a lot of pocket holes when building a cabinet. I'll first start off with all the stretchers. After all those stretchers are done, I can then add pocket holes to the bottom of the cabinet on both sides. And once again, I'm using the goingmake pocket hole jig, which in this case seems to do a really good job and is very comparable to the Craig jig. Once all those pocket holes are done, we can then begin to add wood glue and pocket hole screws. And for 3/4 inch plywood, it's recommended to use 1¼ inch coarse threaded pocket hole screws. Now the nice thing about pocket hole screws is once again you don't need a whole lot of clamps. Typically I just use a pocket hole clamp to get things started, and then once a screw's driven in, everything is held together nicely. Now I'm not sure wood glue is entirely necessary when using pocket hole screws for shop furniture. However, I'm not quite sure what I'll be putting in these cabinets, so I want this thing to be built like a brick shitter. So better to put in a strong foundation now and not have any regrets later. After everything's screwed together nice and tight, I can slide in that back panel and tack it into place. Well, that's going to make our third cabinet put together with pocket hole screws and wood glue. This was a little bit more time consuming to make, but it came together very nicely. Now I already noticed I made one mistake on the very top here, as the pocket hole screws should have been on the top versus the bottom of this cabinet. However, I don't think they'll get seen that often and it shouldn't be that big of a deal. And this is my favorite assembly so far. It's very sturdy and it doesn't have those exposed screws like the last cabinet that we just built. But we have one more cabinet to build, and for this I'm going to break out my rarely used and very expensive domino joiner. And right off the bat, I'm already recognizing a real issue here, as the setup for laying out these dominoes is going to be a pain in the butt. So one of the first things that I did is I tried to figure out where my layout line should be using these squares. And I realized this is going to be a real pain in the butt to mark out those lines for the dominoes. And that's when I remembered that domino joiners have these spring-loaded tabs. This allows you to place your wood right up against that tab so that your dominoes can be perfectly aligned. So using those tabs, I began to bore out my mortises for those panels. And right off the bat, I made a huge error. And this was all my fault. Since I don't use the domino joiner that often, I tend to have to relearn how to use the tool. I actually had the wrong size bit in place, so I had to relearn how to switch out that bit. But once I had the correct bit in and the depth set appropriately, I was able to quickly bore out those mortises. With the mortises in place, I could then add some dominoes and some wood glue and put this thing together. Now, even though everything fit together nicely, it wasn't exactly easy to get this thing to come together. I still had to use clamps to get that glue squeeze out and get the panels to seat together nicely. Once I had the panels in place, it was time to add the mortises for the stretchers. And this became quite the challenge. I had to use the loose setting on the domino joiner along with the tight setting to get these stretchers to fit perfectly. And going back and forth, adding glue, adding clamps, and getting everything to fit together perfectly was kind of a pain in the butt. This took way longer than any other assembly, and caused a lot more frustration. Not to mention, I still had to use clamps on this assembly until that glue set, making this by far the most time-consuming build out of the 4. Well, that's going to make our fourth cabinet assembled with dominoes and glue, and I've got nothing to say but that sucked. Now, it's probably due to my inexperience of doing the setup for cabinets with the domino joiner, but this cabinet took me twice as long as any other cabinet. Now, the cabinet does feel very secure and it's got no visible joinery, which is a nice bonus. But for me, the setup time using the domino joiner is just not worth it. So which assembly method did I like the most? Well, if I had to pick one way to assemble a cabinet, I'd have to say the glues and screws. The problem is I just don't like seeing those screws on the outside of the cabinet. And because of this, I'm going to have to go with the old favorite of using pocket hole screws and glue. So I'm going to assemble the last 2 cabinets using pocket hole joinery, and then we can work on the toe kicks and wrap up this video. And I won't bore you by going through this whole process again, but this went much smoother. It's quick, it's easy, and it doesn't require a whole lot of clamps to hold it into place until that glue sets. And even though it does require a little bit more work on the front end, once those screws are in place, this thing is ready to go. So I finally got all 6 cabinets built, and I'll have to say I'll stick with my decision on going with pocket holes for the last 2 cabinets. So now it's time to tackle the toe kicks, and this is a method that I've never tried before, so we're going to go through this process together. And this entire toe kick is going to be made out of good old-fashioned 2x4s. So the first measurement that I need is the length of 3 of the cabinets together, and that comes in at right about 72 inches. The next measurement that I need is the depth of the cabinets, and as to be expected, it's right at 23.5. So I'm first going to mark out 2 of the 2x4s to about 66 inches. This will give me about a 3-inch overhang on either side of the cabinets. So I'll cut the 2 2x4s together so that they're the exact same length. Next, I'll set my stop block at 17.5 for the stretchers of the toe kick. This will give me a 3-inch overhang for the toe kick, and it accounts for the thickness of those 2x4s. Once I've cut all these stretchers down to size, I can begin assembly. And for this, I'm simply using 3-inch wood screws to connect everything together. And here I'll add 2 screws on either side of the stretchers. I'm going to have 2 on each end and 3 in the middle. So here's the idea of how I understand this toe kick to work. The first thing that you want to do is to take a level and make sure that your toe kick is completely level in every direction. And I got really lucky on this, as I'm completely level both horizontally and vertically. But if I wasn't level, this is where I would add the shins. And because I'm so lucky, I can begin to add 3 cabinets to each toe kick. Once they were in place, I could give them a little bit of a toe test and everything looked good. And once I have one set of cabinets leveled out and on top of those toe kicks, it's important to do the same thing with the other cabinets. And it's also important to make sure that the cabinets are level to each other, as we're going to be placing a solid surface that runs the span of this entire cabinet length. Well, I really appreciate you joining me today on this first video of this major upgrade to my shop. We've got a lot more work to do, and I hope you'll join me for the other videos. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and leave a comment. It really does help out this small woodworking channel. Also, make sure you check out my website, www.flynndoggwoodwork.com. Until next time, take care as always. Thanks again to Aiper for sponsoring this video. Check out the links below to see how you can get the amazing Aiper Scuba S1 Pro.